Welcome back to the course. This is Introduction to Azure Networking, and this is Lesson 5, where you'll deploy your first Azure Bastion. By way of introduction, just a quick recap that links to the prerequisites for the course can be found in the Introduction section, and links to the deployment scripts, which are hosted on GitHub, can be found in the Resources section. In this lesson, we'll learn how to reuse, update, and remove resources from the deployments performed in the previous lessons, how to add a third subnet to the virtual network for Azure Bastion, how to create a public IP address and an Azure Bastion, how to connect to the first virtual machine over the internet, even though it no longer has a dedicated public IP address, and how to connect to the second and third virtual machines over the internet instead of connecting over the virtual network from the first virtual machine. Let's review the topology diagram for this lesson. First, let's recap on the resources that we're reusing from the previous lessons. These include the resource group, the virtual network, and both of its subnets, and all three virtual machines and their associated resources. Inside the virtual network, we now also have a third subnet, a bastion, and its associated public IP address. And now let's see what this looks like in the Azure portal once everything's been deployed. Here we are in the resource group view, and we can see a list of the resources we've deployed. From the top, we have the existing application security groups used to control internet and virtual network access. Next, we can see the bastion and its associated public IP address. Then we can see the network security groups for both subnets within the virtual network. We can then see the virtual machines and their associated resources. And finally, we can see the virtual network. Now it's time for our demonstration, so let's get started. Here we are in Visual Studio Code. We have the deployment script open and a terminal is ready. As usual, before we execute the script, let's review it so that we can understand what it's doing. From the top, we have our variables. Here we can see that we're reusing the resource group and the location from the previous deployments. We're going to disassociate the NAT gateway from both subnets. We'll delete the NAT gateway and its public IP address, and we'll also remove a security rule from the network security group of the first subnet. To do this, we'll need the names of the NAT gateway and its public IP address, along with the names of the virtual network and both of its subnets, as well as the name of the network security group for the first subnet. We're going to add a new subnet for the bastion, so we need the name of the subnet and its IP address prefix. To add the bastion itself, we need its name, which we'll use to standardize the name of its public IP address. And finally, we're going to update the network interface of the first virtual machine to disassociate its public IP address, which we'll then also delete. To do this, we need the name of the virtual machine, its public IP address, and its network interface. Now we have our variables defined, we can start to include the resources in the deployment. First, we can disassociate the NAT gateway from the first and second subnets. This requires the name and resource group of the virtual network, along with the name of the subnet, and the parameter to remove the NAT gateway. Next, we can delete the NAT gateway along with its public IP address. This just requires their names and resource group. We can then add the new subnet for Bastion. To do this, we need the name and resource group of the virtual network, along with the name and address prefix of the subnet. Next, we can create the public IP address for the Bastion. For this, we need its name and resource group, along with its location, its SKU, and the allocation method. We can then create the bastion itself. This requires its name and resource group, along with its location and SKU, the virtual network, and public IP address. Optionally, we can enable tunneling, which will allow us to connect via the Azure portal and also via the command line using the Azure CLI. Next, we can disassociate the public IP address from the first virtual machine. To do this, we need the name and resource group of the network interface, along with the name of the IP configuration, and the parameter to remove the public IP address. We can then delete the public IP address that was previously associated to the first virtual machine. For this, we just need the name of the public IP address and its resource group. And finally, we can remove the security rule which permitted inbound SSH for the first virtual machine. For this, we need the name of the network security group and its resource group, along with the name of the security rule. We can now execute the script which will deploy the resources. Here we are again in Visual Studio Code, this time with our terminal window maximized. Let's execute the script and observe the deployment. If you're following along, in a moment you may wish to pause the video here until the deployment is complete on your side. During the script execution, you may be prompted to install an extension to deploy the Bastion. If so, simply enter Y for yes and hit return, and the script will continue to execute. Now our deployment is complete, let's change over to the Azure portal to review our resources. Here we are in the Azure portal, back in the resource group view. Let's review the Bastion. It's important to say that a Bastion deployment can take anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes to reach a succeeded state. We used the no wait parameter to allow our deployment script to complete promptly, so please be patient if the provisioning of your Bastion isn't yet in a succeeded state. Here we can see that the Bastion is associated to the new subnet and public IP address that we just created, and there are currently no sessions in progress. Let's go back to the resource group, and next let's look at the first virtual machine. Here we can see that the virtual machine no longer has a public IP address associated to it. Finally, let's go back to the resource group, and let's review the virtual network. Under subnets, we can see our newly created subnet for Azure Bastion. Now that we've reviewed our resource deployment, let's connect to the virtual machines over the internet, this time using the Bastion. Here we are back in the resource group view. Let's go back into our first virtual machine, and let's choose Connect via Bastion. Here we can see that we'll use the Bastion that we've just created. The Azure portal knows this is a Linux virtual machine, so it automatically chooses SSH for the protocol with the default port of 22. We'll enter the username and password for the virtual machine. Before choosing Connect, please be aware that if you have a pop-up blocker enabled in your browser, then you can either deselect the option to open in a new browser tab, or you may need to adjust the settings of your browser to enable Bastion connections. We'll now choose Connect. And in our new tab, we can see that we have an SSH connection to our first virtual machine. Next, let's return to the resource group. And this time, we'll try and connect to the second virtual machine. Again, we'll choose Connect via Bastion. And again, we'll enter the username and password. Here we can see that in another tab, we also have an SSH connection to our second virtual machine. In Lesson 3, you may recall that we restricted inbound SSH access to the second subnet. This means that the Bastion will not currently be able to connect to the third virtual machine. You could connect over the virtual network from the first or second virtual machines, but with the knowledge you've gained so far throughout this course, you already have the skills to add a security rule to permit this traffic. Why don't you give this a try? If you need a hint, look back through the deployment scripts at the previous security rules you've already created. Lastly, you may recall that when we reviewed the deployment script, we enabled the optional tunneling parameter. This enables native client support, which means you can establish a connection to the virtual machine directly from the command line. Also, with the knowledge you've gained so far throughout this course, you already have the skills to establish this connection. Why don't you give this a try too? If you need a hint, look at the documentation for the AZ network Bastion commands to see if you can spot which command and parameters to use. That concludes this lesson. I hope to see you in the next one, where you'll deploy your second Azure virtual network and establish a peer-to-peer connection to the first virtual network. See you next time.